Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another event in this most splendid of creations, the York Festival of Ideas. On the way out from a session that I chaired the other night, I spoke to a wonderful lady. I think she'd been to 17 events across the course of this particular festival and was just loving it, absorbing all sorts of different subjects that she wasn't an expert in, didn't have any prior knowledge of. She was just thriving on it, loved every single second of it, and I don't blame her. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Cowop, late of BBC Radio York, still in their employ for another fortnight, so I've got to be careful what I say, but we parted company about 3 weeks ago. It's my pleasure to chair the event for this evening, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the University of York in person. But it's rather like the lady I met the other night. You've been to umpteen events, you'll be quite used to it. You've probably got your own regular seat by now. Before I forget to say this, there will be an opportunity to ask our guests this evening questions at the end. So you think of something, hold on to it and get ready to ask, and you'll get the opportunity to do that. So on to this evening's event. I'm delighted to welcome Julian Richards. Julian is an archaeologist, an author and an educator specialising in the prehistory of Britain and with a long-standing involvement with Stonehenge. In his long career, he has directed major field work and worked in both commercial archaeology and for English heritage, before a career change to broadcasting and education. Julian presented programmes for the BBC. He did not present Time Team. You can ask him about that later. It makes him twitch. He is perhaps best known to all of us from programmes like Meet the Ancestors and the wonderful Blood of the Vikings on BBC Two and the very excellent Mapping the Town on BBC Radio 4. More recently, Julian has been involved in writing, devising and delivering community archaeology projects, working with schools, making non-broadcast film and curating museum exhibitions. Tonight, Julian is going to lead us in a captivating discussion, and I know it's going to be that because I shared a dinner table with him the other night, and you're going to be fascinated, on why science may not have all the answers to our questions about the past, and why we might need our imaginations to bring the past to life. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker, Julian Richards.
Right, that was, yes, that was less Mickey-taking than I thought it was going to be after the dinner event. As that wonderful introduction said, and let's just get it out of the way, I've never been on Time Team. I'm probably one of the few archaeologists in the country that hasn't been on Time Team. I am an archaeologist, and here you see me in my natural habitat, in a field, covered in mud, with a very small trowel and looking very happy. This is what I've enjoyed doing now for the last 50-odd years. And it's always intriguing when you ask people, what does an archaeologist do? Particularly when you ask, you know, is it Indiana Jones? And no, I don't have a bullwhip. I never found any treasure. And unlike Indiana Jones, I don't tend to destroy the archaeological sites that I've just discovered, which seems to be an almost inevitable consequence of what he does in his films. I think children have an idea that this is what an archaeologist is like, you know. And in fact, I do fit some of those things. I've got a beard. I do occasionally wear shorts. And what comes up when you talk to children often is that they will come up with the idea that you dig. This is a very important part of being an archaeologist. And that you're looking for things. And particularly words like treasure will come up. And sometimes they'll say artefacts, even though I'm not quite sure that they understand what an artefact is. But there's generally this sense of finding things. And this is actually part of what we do as archaeologists, but I've always liked to think that archaeologists are like detectives, and these are the clues that lead us to our understanding of the past. So they're not objects for object's sake. We don't sort of simply dig them up to put them in a museum. We excavate them because of what they can tell us about the past. And the key thing is that the past is about people. It's not about the objects. It's about people in the past. This is another common misconception that you get. I did an event here on Saturday for children explaining how archaeology works. Crikey, is it that bad already? Oh, right, okay. Explaining to children how archaeology works by means of an indoor dig. And the first thing that came up was one little boy sort of said, you look for dinosaurs. And I'm going, no, it's not dinosaurs, that's paleontology. And some of you may have been here for the amazing dinosaur hunting lecture on Saturday lunchtime by Phil Manning, a friend of mine. It's all about people. And what we're trying to do is discover about people's lives. So yes, the objects can tell us things because it was people who made and used and broke and discarded or buried the pottery, the fragments of which we find on excavations. It was people who built the structures that tell us about how they lived, where they dwelt, the industries that they carried out. It was people who built the temples, the cathedrals, which tell us about what people thought, what their beliefs were. But it's people that are behind all of these things. And so that is what archaeology is about. And it's also about how people change their environment. Because the environment that we see today is far from the natural environment of the time of the Mesolithic, of the time of the last hunters and gatherers, up to about 5,000 years ago. Today, we see a landscape that is entirely man-made. Nothing's natural about it. The field patterns, the roads, the houses, they're all a human creation. So this is what we're trying to explore. And the processes of doing this, and this is where the themes of this year's Festival of Ideas come in. This idea of discovery and rediscovery, of interpretation and imagination come in. Because the process starts with the discovery, with the excavation, excavation of sites of all sorts of periods. This is an amazing Neolithic settlement in Orkney where work's been going on for many years. Trying to find these remains that people have left behind, and also by using the people themselves, their remains, the skeletal remains, whether buried or cremated, that can tell us about these people's lives. So I've always found it a great fascination in what you can tell from objects and the stories that these objects can tell you. And I always get a great joy from finding things, I have to confess, even after all this amount of time, to dig something up and feel that you are the first person that's had contact with that for 500 or maybe 5,000 years. It still gives me a thrill. And it's equally joyous, or perhaps even more joyous, to see that connection being made when you're working with school children. And I've done lots of excavations with school pupils, primary school age. There's absolutely no reason why they can't do a perfectly good, proper, professional job on an excavation. My last major excavation was at Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, where we had nearly 400 primary school children working on the site, not all at the same time, I hasten to add. When I put in for my scheduled monument consent application with Historic England, I was slightly economical with the truth. I said we're going to be using volunteers under adult supervision. I didn't mention that the volunteers were going to be between 8 and 10 years old, because I thought they might say no, but they did a fantastic job. And that connection, it's wonderful. This was a project we did looking for, in fact, we were looking for a Saxon village, and we were digging next to the church in a village called Durrington, digging test pits in the vicar's garden, very, very compliant vicar, and we started finding flint. And this little girl picked up the first piece and said, what's this? And I said, oh, that's a piece of Mesolithic flint. That's very unusual, well done. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then she said, is this another one? And I said, yes. And I was digging in the same pit as her. And then she sort of said, and this is another one? And I was going, yes. And she found all of the Mesolithic flints on that pit. I wasn't jealous, of course. But of course, what something like that does to tell a child that this is something, you're the first person to hold that for probably 7,000 years. There's something magical in terms of that connection and in what it stirs in the imagination. Because these tiny little flints were made at a time when the landscape and everything was so different. And you can say to them, this was heavily wooded. There were bears in the woods. There were wolves. There were beavers in the river. This was a time when people were living as part of the natural world, when they were hunting giant wild cattle like aurochs. And, it's an extraordinary way that these objects can transport you back into a different world. And it doesn't even need to be that old either. Another project we did was looking for a First World War horse hospital. It was called Operation Warhorse, reflecting the title of Michael Morpurgo's wonderful work. And here, this was what was so exciting. These are the nails that held the corrugated iron sheets onto the wooden frames of the buildings of the horse hospital. So every single one of those was a connection with that hospital, with those horses, and with that incredible story. So these objects can make that connection with the past. 2 fragments of War Department pottery from that excavation. Look at the dates on them, 1914, 1918, bracketing those 4 years of that terrible conflict. These objects can tell stories. I first made this connection. It's hard to believe that that is me, isn't it? But this was me shortly after I'd left school. Sadly, under a slight cloud, I didn't do very well at school, and my headmaster's report said something like, I hope Richards finds something to do with his life, but I doubt it. It's not the sort of thing headmasters are allowed to say today, really, is it? But I was so lucky because I discovered archaeology almost immediately. I ended up on an excavation in my hometown of Nottingham, and as soon as I did it, I knew it was what I wanted to do, because suddenly the past came to life. It wasn't just dry dates and kings and popes and battles. It was a connection with people who'd lived in Nottingham hundreds of years ago. And the fact that objects can tell stories, it was this object that really did it for me, because one of the first things that I dug when I'd learnt how to dig was a medieval cesspit. And I didn't realise that it was a cesspit until I got down to the bottom of it. But at the bottom of it, in this slightly greeny coloured soil, was a bronze key. And I remember sitting there holding it and thinking, how has that got here? What story could this tell? Was it the man who'd lived in the posh house that we found the remains of coming back one night from the trip to Jerusalem and dropping his door key in the cesspit? We will never know, but it made me think that objects could tell stories. Now, it's very easy for us to explore, for us to discover, to go through that process, because there is so much information that is out there, especially these days when it's so accessible. Because we can go to our local record offices, if we look online, we can find historic maps that tell us where things happened. We can look for names that give us clues about pottery manufacture or mills. Sometimes we can even find illustrations of sites that have long gone. I was so jealous yesterday when I went to Fountains Abbey. I had a little bit of time off, went to Fountains Abbey to see those soaring remains, because the abbey in Shaftesbury surrendered in 1539. 15 years later, that was all that was left, this tiny little sketch. And then 20 years after that, gone, wiped off the face of the earth. But we've got all of this documentary evidence that starts that process. We can now go to historic environment records held by each county or nationally by bodies like Historic England, where all the finds that have been made before are collated, and you can actually access these. So you can start your own process of discovery. There are so many aerial photographs online which give us clues to activity in the past in the form of marks showing in crops and soil. So this process of discovery, it's been so democratized recently that all of these sources of evidence are available for people to study. LiDAR, aerial-borne laser radar. There's loads and loads of LiDAR data now available online. So it's nice to be able to see the outline of really obvious sites that we know about. But in the area not far from where I live, a group of amateurs have been looking at the LiDAR data for the New Forest, for the Cranbourne Chase area, and have found new barrows, have found new long barrows. They're really contributing to our understanding of a prehistoric landscape. So all of these things are available. This process of discovery is not exclusive. It's available to all of us. If you want to move on further in the process of discovery, then there are techniques like geophysical survey, which can actually see through the soil in the way that aerial photographs and LiDAR can't, and produce patterns of hidden archaeology. Any of you who've watched Time Team, which I'm sure many of you will have done, this term geophys, which is a term I hate, I have to admit, but this is what we're talking about, being able to scan through the soil to detect subsoil buried remains. So all of these ways we can explore the sites, we can locate areas of activity. I spent many years doing this, field walking ploughed fields in winter. I remember somebody saying, why don't you do it in the summer? And he pointed out that in the summer there were crops this high. You could only do it in the winter, but looking for artefacts, looking for scattered surface remains, which again provide another layer of clues. So there are all these ways in which this process of discovery can start. But then beyond that, the process of discovery has to move into excavation, where you're reversing the accumulation of deposits that have happened over hundreds or thousands of years. You're removing this stratigraphy in the reverse order of which it accumulated. And most importantly, you're recording it all in great detail as you do that. Because the one thing you have to remember is that excavation is destruction. Once you've dug it, you can't put it back. And so what you must do is to record in great detail through photographs, through drawings, through recovering the artifacts, exactly what is there so that you can reconstruct what you've destroyed in record form, and that those records are available for other people to study in perpetuity. So that's the process. There's two questions I'm often asked when digging. First one is, what are you going to find? And the answer is generally, I don't quite know. I've got an idea, because I've used all of those techniques that we've talked about already, of what I might find. But realistically, I don't know, because if I did, I wouldn't be bothering to dig it. The second question, which is another intriguing one, is how deep are you going to go? To which the answer to that is, I don't know. And it's an interesting question, and there are assumptions there. If you're in a rural landscape like this, you strip off a very thin layer of soil and you're down to the archaeology. You're down to the ditches and the pits that are dug into the underlying subsoil. If you are in York, you have to go an awfully long way down, as you'd probably be aware if you visited something like the Jorvik Centre or you've seen any excavations taking place in York. And that is because in this one location, you've got layer upon layer of activity. You've got buildings being put up, destroyed, levelled off, another building put up. And so from Roman and Viking and medieval and later times, you've got this amazing depth of accumulation. In Salisbury, the nearest city to where I live, because that city was founded in the 12th century, and in some cases the buildings that were put up then are still there isn't that depth of stratigraphy of deposits, because you haven't had the same intensity of occupation and destruction that you've had in other areas. So it's a question that you can't answer. This idea of discovery, yes, there's still new things out there to be discovered, but one of the themes of this year's festival is rediscovery. And there is a value to going back to sites that you might think have answered all the questions in the past and re-examining them. And a classic example of this, the Roman town of Silchester. It's out in the Hampshire countryside. Unlike virtually every other Roman town, like York or Winchester or Exeter or London, Silchester was abandoned. So now you have a very big wall around a series of fields. And the Society of Antiquaries in the early 19th, early 20th century stripped the whole of the interior and produced their plan of Roman Silchester. They found solid buildings. These are the pili of underfloor heating. They found walls. And in fact, their methods basically involved digging until you found a wall, and then you dug along the wall. So this is classic wall chasing archaeology. But they produced a plan of the whole of the Roman town. And you might think, that's it, that's done. But my friend Mike Fulford from Reading University spent about a decade excavating one insula between part of the Roman road pattern that grids out the centre of Silchester, and found the Roman timber buildings that these early archaeologists hadn't spotted, the underlying Iron Age archaeology of the oppidum that was there, layer upon layer of archaeology that was not recorded or recognised by those early archaeologists. So there are huge benefits to re-examining, rediscovering from some of these sites. And of course, the way that we dig things has changed. Sir Mortimer Wheeler at Maiden Castle. Wheeler, a brilliant storyteller, somebody who could take objects from the past and create stories from them, a great showman as well. And interestingly, somebody who was criticised by his peers for popularising archaeology. Seems very strange, doesn't it, the idea that you should be criticised, but there's a wonderful anecdotal story about Wheeler at the Society of Antiquaries in London, where one of his fellow archaeologists said, well, Rick, as far as I'm concerned, I write for just 6 people, meaning I'm academic, and to which Wheeler's response was, I'm surprised you're that ambitious. So a nicely waspish, but basically Wheeler believed in spreading the word, in telling the stories, some of them slightly embroidered, that archaeology could tell you. But this was the way he dug. These are Wheeler boxes, where you dig in these square boxes and you leave bits in between. You leave these balks in between. Now, any archaeologist who's dug in this way will know that the most interesting finds and the bit where layers from this trench meet that lead are always in that bit between the boxes, which is why these days we excavate in open areas. We don't leave these balks like that. We record the layers where they are, and then we take them down so that we get a picture, a wider picture, which you don't get if you dig in the way that Wheeler did. Now, the excavation is the exciting bit. This is the bit that people generally want to get involved in because it's outdoors, it's exciting, you're finding things, you're discovering things. But for 1 week in the field, you probably got to spend several months indoors. You have the finds to process, you have the finds to analyse, you have the reports to write. Once you get into the laboratory, it does take a lot longer. And it's taking even longer these days because we have so many new techniques that we can use to discover how objects were made, what they were made of, where they've come from. It's just staggering. I mean, I have been an archaeologist for over 50 years now, and I'm just amazed at the advances that have taken place over that time. When I started, I would never have imagined that we could analyse things in the same way. So take our staple, pottery, the fragments of pottery that we excavate that are important clues about activities, about rites, about trade. You can look at the clay that they're made of now. We can look at the inclusions within the clay body. In the past, we tended to look at the shape of them and go, well, the shape of this is very similar to the shape of that, so this is where they've come from. But now, by taking thin slices of the fired clay and looking at the mineral content within them, we can start to tell some extraordinary stories. It always amazes me when I'm in Dorset on the top of a hill and I know that pottery that was found there was made on the Lizard in Cornwall, which is about 170 miles away as the crow flies. These fragile vessels are made of clay that can only have come from that area because of what the clay includes. It's staggering. Why? Why are they bringing fragile pots over this sort of distance? Because they're special. They're clearly special. But it's the science that's told us that. But intriguingly, there are some things, and it was said in the introduction, you know, the fact that science can't give us all the answers. This is a beaker pot from the very earliest metal using age, the Copper Age. Not even the Bronze Age, but the Copper Age in this country, so dating to about 2400 BC at the earliest. These are made in a way that when they're fired, the oxygen gets to the whole pot and the surface of them is a beautiful uniform orange colour. And we don't actually know how they did this. I have never seen a replica Bronze Age beaker pot that actually looks right. And nobody's been able to show to me yet exactly how these people did it. We know that it's all something to do with the advent of metallurgy, because to smelt metals, you need to create high temperatures. And so the pottery manufacture is something to do with that. But no amount of experimentation so far has told us precisely how they do that. And this thing about stones making journeys, stones telling stories, again, I'm sorry, you are going to get some references to Stonehenge here, I can't help it. But the stones, the blue stones at Stonehenge, which we've known for a century, come from the Preseli Hills in Wales because of pioneering geological work that was done in 1923. We can now go to the Preselis and we can go to precise outcrops and go, we know where this stone came from. It came from this outcrop. And that, again, it's extraordinary to stand at these places and think of the journey that those stones has made. And this is where imagination takes over, because, you know, why, how? There are so many questions that this scientific knowledge tells us. Now, I have to admit, I couldn't resist when we were there, because we were filming this the week before, and I decided that I had to do the classic archaeological programme, stand on top of a crag with my hair blowing in the wind, while Steve, my filmmaker friend, flew his drone round and round me. I don't know what we're going to do with this, but I just couldn't resist doing it while I was there. You'll recognise the shot from so many archaeological programmes. It's the same with metals. But metals are more of a problem, because when metal first appears in this country, the copper, the gold, we can actually tell where it came from, because it's come from a source and it's been used. By the time we get into the Bronze Age, something like this has been recycled so many times, because bronze can be reused, it can be melted down, it can be recast, that the picture blurs. And we can't tell exactly where those metals have come from. Very occasionally, of course, we get sites that offer us such a huge range of other types of information. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Must Farm, this incredible site in the Fens, which is sometimes referred to as the Pompeii of the Fens, because what happened was that a Bronze Age roundhouse, which was built out over a swampy area on a series of wooden piles, caught fire and collapsed. The burning timbers collapsed into the water, into the mud, where they were preserved, charred but preserved. So in a situation like this, we don't just get the solid objects that we normally get, but you get the timber, you get the environmental evidence, you get the organic remains, you get pots still with the food inside them that was being cooked and which may have been the cause of the fire that burnt the house down. So there are just occasional times where the range of information that we have is far greater than we normally get. And it's the same with people as well, in terms of what we can tell about people from their remains. My first exposure to human remains came just when I'd started work after I graduated, where I was asked to go and examine a place where a tree had blown over in somebody's garden and it had pulled some bones up. And despite the fact that the local police mounted an all-night guard on the site in case it was a murder victim. I think somebody then pointed out that the tree looked as if it was at least 200 years old, and they probably weren't going to find who the victim was. So this is when archaeology became involved, and the first clue was the fact that the skull, the first skull that appeared, was looking out of the tree roots. It was a little bit of a shock to the owner of the cottage to see this skull grinning out the tree roots, but there was the first clue: buried face down, a prone burial. Hints of Romans, and in fact the one intact burial, a gentleman with hobnail boots on. He'd got iron nails under the soles of his feet. It was a classic Roman hobnail burial. What it made me realise, in the same way that that key had given me this sort of a clue about how objects could tell stories, was the realisation that this wasn't just an archaeological specimen. And obviously you go through the processes that you have to go through of excavation, cleaning, photographing, drawing, and then the somewhat weird process of dismantling somebody, putting the left foot in one bag, the right foot in another bag, legs, the pelvis, and finally ending up with the skull. That's the archaeological process, but done with the realisation that this is a person, and a person with a story to tell. Because I realised that this person, buried maybe about 200 AD, knew the landscape that I was trying to discover using all those methods I've already talked about. If that person could talk, they could tell me so much, but they couldn't. So there are ways, there are things that we can understand almost immediately from the way somebody is buried. A crouched burial like this in the south of England has to be prehistoric. It can't be any other date. If you find something as anatomically incorrect as this is somebody's skull by their knee, then you think their head's come off, this is a Roman burial. It's a very peculiar sort of Roman decapitation burial. Burials east-west in neat rows, they're Christian. They can't be anything else. Somewhat weird, you do get some strange things occurring in Christian cemeteries, medieval cemeteries. This poor lady was obviously buried and hadn't been buried for long when we assume the man and the woman died together, and a large grave was dug for both of them, which involved removing the lower half of the lady, which was then distributed across their burial. Very, very odd thing to find, but east-west, Christian. And then obviously objects with burials can tell you something as well. And I don't think you need to be that much of a detective to work out that a large male buried with a shield, a sword, and an entire horse is probably some sort of a warrior. This is a Saxon burial from Lakenheath in Suffolk. So, you know, the very physical nature of the burials, the skeleton, the way it lies in the grave, the objects that are with it, they're going to be the start of the story. And then the examination, the physical examination of the bones, you know, when you find a jaw like this, when you find a lower jaw like this, where so many of the teeth have been lost and the bone's been reabsorbed, you're dealing with somebody who's quite elderly. We can use X-rays to look at the bones, where lines like this that appear either in the bones or sometimes in the tooth enamel point to periods of either starvation or disease during childhood when somebody's growing up. So you can see you're gradually starting to build up a picture of somebody's life. Radiocarbon dating will tell you more precisely when somebody died. And it's a very simple process. You know, it's complicated science, but to explain it to children, it's fine. We all contain carbon, some of it's radioactive. When an organism, whether it's us or a tree or an animal dies, the radioactivity starts to fade away, and then we measure how far back, how much of it's faded away. That tells us when something stopped living. So we can use bones, charcoal, antler picks, leather if it survives, wood, all of those things can provide radiocarbon dates. But there are some things that are better than others. Because if you carbon date a piece of wood, What you don't know, if it's a lump of wood, is whether it's come from there in a tree or there in a tree. And of course, that can be a distant difference if it's something like oak of hundreds of years. So a twig, a single grain, or a tiny piece of hazelnut is better because it's got a shorter life. And now, when I started work and had first radiocarbon dates done, you needed a huge amount for a sample. Now, tiny little things like a single grain can be radiocarbon dated with great precision. So we can start to narrow things down in time. And also, there's a side effect of this in that it will tell us whether somebody had a predominantly marine or terrestrial diet. So we can start to get dietary information as well. And this is all, as I say, starting to build up this picture. But to me, the most significant advances that have taken place are in the study of isotopes and of DNA. Because if, for example, this Neolithic burial had been discovered when I first started digging 50 years ago, what we would have been able to tell is that there was one adult and 3 children, probably all of them between about 8 and 12 years old. We would have been able to get a fairly crude radiocarbon date from some of the bones, but that would have been it. But with advances in DNA, we can now study the genetics. We can work out that, yes, there is an adult woman, and of the 3 children, 2 of them are girls, 1 of them's a boy. But more significantly, we can look at kinship links, and we can say that one of the children is the child of the woman, the other 2 aren't, but they are brother and sister. So you can start to tell stories from burials like this. And perhaps even more significantly, and this is one that we did for Meet the Ancestors, 25 years ago now, this was right at the beginning of isotope studies, where by looking at isotopes of oxygen and lead and strontium in the bones, we can start to tell where people have come from, whether or not they grew up, were born and lived on the chalk, which is a particular sort of geology, or somewhere else. And these burials provided a complicated story that they'd started off in the Mendips in a very different sort of geology and had then moved to Cranbourne Chase and possibly made the journey back there at least one time during their lifetime. So this, again, is another element of that human story. And it's all to do with the fact that the water that you drink and the food that you eat are related to the geology on which you're living. Of course, it doesn't work these days because we eat food from all over the world. Our water is piped halfway across the country, so it wouldn't work for burials today, but it's an amazing insight. And of course, one of the most celebrated examples of this sort of study in its early days came from not far from Stonehenge. This is the celebrated Amesbury Archer, the richest Beaker period burial that's been found in the British Isles. Beaker pots, stone wrist guards, tiny copper daggers, some of the first metal to be used, hints that he was a metal worker, gold hair ornaments, somebody of incredible wealth and power, and whose isotopes hinted, as you might have expected somehow, that he wasn't from this country. So this is how it first broke. The Amesbury Archer, an immigrant from Central Europe. And then it was decided initially that he probably came from Germany. Now, the tabloid newspapers, they have an interesting interpretation of things. This was how the Daily Mail saw it. Achtung, Great British Monument may have been built by a German, complete with comedy German. I'm sorry, it doesn't work in several ways. He's not from Germany, he's actually from the Austrian Alps, and he's actually a bit too late to have been anything to do with the rebuilding of Stonehenge in stone in 2500. But as far as the tabloids were concerned, it made a good story. So we can now start to build up far more of a picture of people, not only of their age, of their diet, of their life, whether they had diseases or injuries. It's quite fascinating what we can build up these days. And when we were making the Meet the Ancestors series, what we decided, and what my producer Ian Potts decided we wanted to do, was if we were going to call something Meet the Ancestors, he wanted us to be able to meet our ancestor at the end of the programme. And so we were one of the first people on TV to do forensic facial reconstructions. And this was the first one that we did, crouched burial, late Iron Age in date, from a little village called Bleeden in Somerset, head hard up against the edge of a pit and a very badly crushed skull. It came out in 120 pieces, was reconstructed with wax, cast. The pegs represent the depths of tissue, of muscle structure on the face. So it gets to this stage. And then this is anatomy. So this is discovery, this is analysis, this is anatomy, this is science. But then there is the imagination, the art and the imagination that turns that into the person. And we don't know if that is exactly what that person looked like. Science has taken us so far, but then beyond that, we have to use our imagination, the wonderful power of our human imagination, to create an image of what that person looked like. But it's not just an artist's impression. This is going as far as we can with the science and then using the art beyond it. And it's fascinating the way that things like this raise questions, because we called the people from the name of the place that they came from. So we had Peterborough woman and Spitalfields woman. Now, sadly, he was Bleeden Man, because that's where he came from. So one Saturday, we took Bleeden Man back to the Bleeden Coronation Hall to meet the Bleeden villagers. And when we unveiled the head, there was a fascinating reaction from some of the audience. First one was, "Here, he looks like us." And I thought, well, why shouldn't he look like us? But I think what it was that they'd been told this is a prehistoric man. So if it was somebody, you know, with knuckles dragging on the ground and brows like this, that would have been what they envisaged. But I said, no, this is a modern human, a person just like us. If you put him in modern clothes and he walked down Bleeden High Street, nobody bat an eyelid. Except they went, "Here, he looks an awful lot like you, Ralph." And he did. He looked ever so much like somebody from the village who, in what I would now regard as some slightly dubious DNA work, but was okay for the time, it was suggested that there was a link between this person and this person. I wouldn't push it these days, but we genuinely, the science told us that at the time. What it did do was led to possibly my weirdest television appearance, which was on the sofa one morning with the head, Ralph, and Richard and Judy. We've obviously moved on from there. That was a very physical reconstruction. We can now do exactly the same thing digitally. Scan the skull, put in the digital pegs, create the muscle structure and everything, and produce astonishingly, scarily lifelike images of people. You know, this really is bringing the past to life. They are quite extraordinary. Again, but based on the science, the analysis, but then with that element of imagination. And of course, the great advantage now is that DNA is starting to tell us more about things like hair colour, which we had no idea about that in the past. And of course, so we can do this with people. We can also do it with the places where people lived. And I think this is, to me, one of the most fascinating areas of reconstruction and physical rebuilding, because the house, the home, is something that is so fundamental to all of us, isn't it? You know, all humans need exactly the same things. We need food, we need water, we need companionship, we need shelter. And to create a prehistoric or an ancient house, I think, is something very powerful, because it links us, it roots us in with that. And I work very closely with a leading experimental archaeologist called Luke Winter, who formerly was the head of the Ancient Technology Centre in Cranbourne, and who's built some extraordinary structures, including a full-size Viking longhouse, which he was told by the structural engineer would not stand up. It's been standing now for about 12 years and shows no signs of falling over. pure experimentation. But what Luke does is take the evidence from the archaeology, the plan of the post holes that have been discovered from excavation, to think, to work out how this might work, to create small scale models, to then go to concept sketches, again, of how this is going to work structurally. You know, you have to have sound structural knowledge behind it, and then translate that into full-scale replication of the building, starting with the posts that come from the post plan. And obviously that is really as far as the archaeology takes you. Beyond that, it's understanding of the capabilities of the material, of the engineering required, and your imagination. And then the building gradually develops, the frame goes up, the walls are covered, the roof goes on, until in the end you have a structure. One thing to remember, so importantly though, is that this is not what that building might have looked like, it's how it might have looked. This is something I think people forget with experimentation. It's going to tell you how something might have been. It's not a definitive answer. There could be a number of other interpretations based on that same evidence. And it's interesting because when I did the indoor dig on Saturday with the children, this is effectively what we do. There's a plan, and then you excavate it, and then you build up using wooden posts and stakes, and you talk about how the walls might have been made, and of course you have to get in the fact that the mud would have also contained poo, because that's a very important ingredient, how the roof would have been made. And somebody said to me afterwards, said, why don't you have a little model of the house as you think it would have been? And I said, no, I don't want to do that, because what I want the people who do this to go away with is an idea of how you discover, but then something in their minds, using their imagination, not being told this is what it looks like. So it's very intriguing. Of course, in some places, it's wonderful. Anybody been to Skara Brae in Orkney? Yeah, I mean, it's just astonishing, because you don't really have to use much imagination there, do you? Because you've got the walls of the houses, you've got beds, you've got a fireplace, you've even got what's known as the dresser, you know, where you put your best pots up, because it's all stone. It's all stone that can be gathered from the beach and used to create something that survives. But of course, it's very different if you're in the south of England, where I work, where the same date houses from the later part of the Neolithic, the time of Stonehenge, this is what you find. Rectangular chalk floor with a hearth and surrounded by a number of holes where wooden stakes went. That's all you've got. But through a process of experimentation, imagination, trying to work out how these things might be built, we now have these at the Stonehenge Visitor Centre, which again are what those house plans might have looked like when they were built. And there was so much that was learnt by the team that built them, mostly volunteers under supervision, about how these houses were built. How do you stop the roof spreading and pushing the walls out? The answer is you have bendy poles that go up the wall and then bend in and are lashed at the roof. So effectively you're creating a solid basket which doesn't spread in that way. Things like that can only be learnt by experimentation, by actually rebuilding. And they are amazing these days because they're weathered, they've had to be rethatched, and they have a lot of objects in them that help people to envisage what life in the Neolithic might have been like. The interior of them contains all the things that we don't find, all the organic remains, the skins, the baskets. The stone tools have the wooden handles on them that you don't find anymore. And then, of course, you've got the contentious bits, because the person that suggested what should be in these houses looked at Skara Brae and said, well, if they've got a stone dresser, why don't we have a wooden dresser? I don't believe this. If you can go to the beach and pick up slabs of stone and stack them up and make something, fine. In a house that's made effectively of stakes and mud and straw, I don't think you're going to have something that's basically as carpentered as this. So, interesting discussion to be had. I don't agree with that particular interpretation, but we don't know. Just to finish off, I told you couldn't get away from Stonehenge completely. I've always been fascinated by how Stonehenge was built, because we have so few clues. I love this card because it was sold by English Heritage years ago, and I think they stopped selling it because it said how they built Stonehenge, and tourists from certain part of the world were taking the card home on the basis that this is how Stonehenge was built. Now, you know, intelligent audience, you know that dinosaurs were not used in the construction of Stonehenge. But how was it done? What do we have to survive? Well, very, very little. A few antler picks, a few stone walls, and the evidence of the structure that is there. But this doesn't stop imagination working. And this is the imagination of Ivan Lapper in the 1980s guidebook to Stonehenge, where he shows the construction site. And there are bits of it that I quite like. I like the idea of raising the lintels on a platform, on a crib of timber. I think that's a very good idea. I think that works. What I'm less convinced about is his imagination that envisages that Stonehenge was built by Kirk Douglas with assistance from Michael Heseltine and George Best. Because he liked putting real people into it. But you know, compare that, and this is of its time, because this person who's shown as the leader, the architect, is carrying objects from a burial mound around Stonehenge. But we now know that those objects are about 500 or 600 years later than that construction, so he couldn't have done it. If you look at the more photorealistic English heritage reconstruction of more recent years, the clues, you know, the antler picks, they survive, but the A-frames, the rope, the rollers, none of that survives. We have no evidence. So we have to use experimentation, we have to use imagination to try and work out how those things might have been done. And people do experiment. This is a group called the Stonehengineers rowing a stone, using levers to lever it up and move it along. I'm not convinced. It works, it's slow, that's 12 tons. 40 tons? Not convinced that that would work, but it's a way that they could have been moved. Less convinced by the gentleman who announced that this was the way the bluestones arrived from Wales in basically a little timber roller, because this lasted for about 200 metres before falling apart. So not convinced by that idea at all. The only full-scale experiment was done by the BBC about 30 years ago with 40-ton block of concrete representing one of the tallest trilithons, which was moved up a slight slope with 130 people on a fairly rudimentary sledge. That shows that that could work, it did work, it might have been how it was done, but not how it was done. And I just have to add that every time I look at this picture, that's me, I do wonder what the three people pushing at the back actually thought they were contributing. You know, did they really think they were making helping this? I don't know. But you know, there's this sense that, you know, how was it done? What I love, though, is that people's imagination doesn't stop them coming up with ideas. And I get quite a lot of these sent to me, including this one from a gentleman in Eastern Europe who told me it was quite simple. They floated the stones to Stonehenge on wooden rafts. And I felt obliged to point out to him that Stonehenge was actually on a hill and it was quite difficult to get water to flow uphill. And also it was on chalk, which is the most porous rock that we have in this country. So that wouldn't work. Equally, the person who's written a book which explains that actually Stonehenge was by the seaside. So it was very easy to get the stones over here. Slight problem with this is that if that was where sea levels were in 2500 BC, where's all the water gone? Because I don't think we've had another ice age since 2500 BC, which is the only way that sea levels drop, because the water's all locked up in polar ice caps. So that doesn't work. It doesn't stop people imagining. That's the key thing. I quite like the idea of the timber crib. It does work. We've experimented with that. But there are alternatives to that, including the utterly insane litholift, whereby you put the lintel on a giant wheel which you trundle along and it just plonks the lintel on top of that. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near that when that was... And the offer of to do this full scale has not been accepted by anybody, because I think it would be monumentally dangerous. So this is what's so fascinating about a question like this. You know, we have little bits of evidence, we can experiment, we can use our imagination. I was lucky to be involved in a project that basically looked at something like that, and we ended up building that. That's full size, 40 tons, and 10 tons on the top. It was done, but I don't think that's how necessarily it was done. And my imagination will continue to think up ideas. I hope what I've done is to show you that science, you know, the processes of discovery, the processes of analysis, they are fascinating. They are continually evolving. Nothing stays still. If anybody tells you that they have a definitive idea about something in the past, of how it happened, say no. That idea will inevitably change as we discover more and as more methods of analysis become available to us. It's just extraordinary. I mean, I hope that I live for quite a bit longer, because the developments are happening so fast these days and the past is getting more exciting. But in these days of, you know, artificial intelligence, which we're all told about and which we should be, I think, quite justifiably terrified about, the one thing that I think transcends all of this is the power of human imagination. You know, what comes out of our extraordinary brains, you know, what comes out of this lump of jelly in our head that is capable of imagination, capable of taking information and creating wonders from it. Next Tuesday, I will be at Stonehenge at the summer solstice. It's a very weird event, but I do like to go there, even if it is the wrong time of year to be there. And every time I go to Stonehenge, I think here is the product of ancient thought, ideas, experimentation, imagination, ingenuity that has lasted 4,000 years or more. And I find that truly inspiring, because it shows that our ancient ancestors were capable of all of these things. So I love being there. And what's equally wonderful is that I know that when I go there, I'm going to meet lots of people with extraordinary imaginations. Possibly these two, who were there a couple of years ago and who just seemed to be very happy to use the power of human imagination for some weird reason to put colanders on their heads and go to Stonehenge at midsummer. So I hope that what I've said has fitted in with the theme of this wonderful, fantastic Festival of Ideas about discovery, about imagination and about rebuilding. You probably tell I still find great joy in archaeology, and I hope that I will for many years to come. And I'm happy, if you have any questions, with the assistance of our chairman, to try and answer those. So thank you for listening to me.
Wow. And, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, as you saw, he stuck to every note he brought onto the stage. I honestly don't think there are many people who can speak for an hour with such fluency and such joy
thank you.
as
Yes,
you have
joy.
done. I've really enjoyed that. Thank you. Have a seat. Have a seat. Have a seat. So, I've scribbled down some questions, but your questions have been much better than mine.
You've spoken about revisiting sites and looking at them again, and all the technological advances and so on. And Stonehenge has been visited and revisited so many times, and it's kind of evolved. And what, in your opinion, is the sort of key thing that has been brought out of Stonehenge?
How long have you got? I mean, one of the problems with Stonehenge is that it's so, well, it's unique. This is the thing. There isn't anything else like it. So it's very difficult to compare it to anything else. You know, normally we can go, oh, well, these things are quite similar, therefore this is going on. Stonehenge is unique in so many ways. The other problem with it is that about 50% of it has been excavated in the past, and not very well, a lot of it. So we have a level of information from those earlier excavations which has been exhaustively reanalysed, and I think we've probably got as much out of that as we can. But there are still areas of, shall we say, dispute. I don't necessarily agree with some of the other people who pronounce about Stonehenge. I mean, a classic example of this, you probably saw on the television, I don't know, a year or so ago, the announcement that the site of the stone circle in Wales had been discovered that was uprooted and taken to Stonehenge. No, it wasn't, but, you know, it was. I know where I would like to go and dig at Stonehenge, something that hasn't been disturbed before, which would answer some of the questions. But because there's only half of it left, it's very precious. And to get the permission to go and do that, I don't think that I'd get it. So we've probably got about as far as we can. We understand the broad chronology. In terms of what it was for, is more difficult because that takes you into the prehistoric mind. That really makes you try and think in the way that somebody in the Neolithic thought, which is actually more difficult. So, we've got as far as we can. We need some more excavation of undisturbed bits, but I'm not convinced it will happen. I think my philosophy is very much the book that I wrote, the English Heritage book that I wrote, and I've done the guidebook and other things, is called Stonehenge, The Story So Far. It's a very deliberate title because we will never get to the end of that story, which is actually quite fascinating.
Stonehenge, to be continued.
To be continued.
Another
yes.
question, please.
Yes.
Do we have another one? Gentleman there with his hand up.
Julian, have you ever been to Malta?
To Malta?
Yes.
I have, but sadly I went to Malta to make a radio programme about Valletta, which involved me flying in, doing a radio programme and flying out. So no, I have not been to see the wonderful Neolithic temples on Malta, which I would very much like to. So I haven't been there to...
It's just that they are said to be the same age as Stonehenge, or sometimes older.
Oh yes, some of them, they are.
Yeah, so it's just that I would wondered if anyone had done a comparison, that's all.
Well, I mean, they're part of a broad megalithic, big stone tradition. They are a bit of an outlier because, I mean, that tradition starts in sort of Brittany area and then spreads up the Atlantic seaboard, through Ireland, Scotland, Orkney, and actually Stonehenge is one of the later manifestations of this megalithic tradition. But there is a terrible tendency for people to look at all large stone structures around the world and produce a link to Stonehenge. The Maltese temples are earlier. They're much earlier in the Neolithic than Stonehenge is, because that big rebuilding at Stonehenge is effectively the last gasp of the Neolithic before we get all of these new influences coming in from the continent. And one thing I didn't mention was that all these genetic studies recently suggest that there's a very rapid replacement of the Neolithic population with, genes from the continent. So, they're part of the broad tradition, but earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Another question? Oh, yes. Here. Thank you.
I'm going to hope I put my point across here, but do you think there are any limits to this, to the usefulness of it? I'm intrigued. Do you think the only limits are people's imagination when we're looking at interpretation of the sites?
Sorry, the limits to...
When you're looking, I mean, I've done experimental archaeology, and when you're looking at sites that don't have very much left, like you were saying, the post holes, is there too much speculation, if you like?
Yes, I mean, I think that as I say, I work very closely with Luke Winter, and the way that we approach things is you start with the evidence. If the evidence doesn't actually allow you to go to that next stage of imagining and then rebuilding, don't do it. And it was one of the things that I've always found frustrating about particularly archaeology on television. And I mean, there's this joke, that you find, one bit of wall here, 2 tesserae here, and suddenly you have a 3D reconstruction of an entire Roman villa complex. You can't do that. The evidence there doesn't allow you to do that. And I don't think that you should, because you're implying that you can somehow, with your archaeological brain, create this from nothing. And that to me is wrong. Only recreate where you have the evidence. I mean, Mick Aston from Time Team was a very good friend of mine. Mick and I worked a lot together, but we did have arguments sometimes about, and I'd sort of say, just that, you found a bit of wall and 2 tesserae and you've got a Roman villa. And he sort of said, well, you recreated that chapel at Poulton in Cheshire. And I say, yeah, but we had the whole ground plan of it, we had the building material, we knew what the roof was made of, and we had an illustration from a 16th century document that showed roughly what it looked like before it was knocked down. So that's why we did a recreation of it. Yeah. And that I thought was fair. So the evidence has got to be the starting point that allows you to move on and use your imagination.
I see what you mean, yeah.
May I ask a question? What is the Holy of Holies? What is it that you are aching to find before you cease your professional career? I once spoke to an archaeologist from the York area who said a city the size of York should have had 2 amphitheatres. And we know where one of them was, and we've no idea where the other one is. And that's always struck me as a sort of, that may or may not be true. This is just me holding on to this in my mind. But is there a Holy of Holies? Is there something that we know should be there that isn't there and hasn't actually been discovered or pinpointed yet?
Oh dear, that is a difficult one. I don't know. When you get back into prehistory, there are so many questions. There are so many unknowns that it's quite difficult to sort of say that's what I would
have expected to be there. Yeah.
Yes, that's what I'm expecting. I mean, the one thing I would love to do, this idea about going back and, if you could go back and do something again. When I'm asked, what's the most exciting thing that you've ever found in your archaeological career? My response is a pit full of rubbish on the top of a hill overlooking Stonehenge. A pit full of pottery, animal bone, flint tools, dating back to about 3,900 BC, some of the earliest pottery found in this country. And when I found it, I thought that it was the meeting of 2 cultures, because there were wild animals and there were domesticated animals. And I thought that it was a group of Mesolithic hunters meeting a group of Neolithic herders and feasting together. And recently, new studies of all this material have come to that same conclusion. And the paper that was produced was called A Meeting in the Woods. Now that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I think I know where there's another one of these pits. And I would give my eye teeth to go back and dig that again, knowing what I know now and what I ought to do 40 odd years later. So,
is there any way we can join together and lobby to get you to do it? Because I'd vote for it, wouldn't you?
It was just, this sense of connection, this idea that these 2 groups of people with different ways of life were what brought them together. And they're eating huge amounts of meat, and then they must be breaking the pots deliberately and burying them as a commemoration of this great event. you know, I wish I could be there. But I can't.
Which team would you have been on?
I think I'd probably have been a hunter-gatherer because I like the idea of living as part of the natural world, because that's what these people were. They were the last people to live as part of nature before we started taming it and altering it. So it's the last, I always call it the last wild Britain. It's the last truly wild Britain that these people are part of.
Was this the equivalent of a Russian aristocrat drinking a shot of vodka and throwing the glass into the fire afterwards, do you think?
I don't know. Or Greek plate smashing, yes. I don't know.
Would you say there's any link between Stonehenge and the Callanish stone circle in the Outer Hebrides? Because they're both circles, they've both got an avenue.
Yeah, I mean, they're both part of this same megalithic tradition. And they're both laid, as are so many of these structures, they are all laid out with an awareness of the celestial bodies of the sun, the moon, the stars. They're placed carefully within their landscapes to reflect a very clear understanding of the heavens. I mean, Stonehenge is very obvious. It's the winter and the summer solstice, but there are equally a lot of other alignments built into it. Sorry?
It was buried. It told us the stones were discovered and about a metre, they were a metre below ground.
What, Callanish?
Well, the bottom of the stones was...
Oh yeah, I mean they're dug into the...
sunk.
Yeah, they're dug into the ground, you know, there are pits that hold the stones. But yeah, I mean there is a link between those and the standing stones in Orkney and in the Lake District, you know, there's a strong link between all of those sites. There's one gentleman at the back there who...
We should be quick because
we'll be chucked out soon.
Our crew get home tonight and
Yes.
de-rig and everything. Sir?
Thank you very much. Is there something unique about the British Isles because it's kind of on the edge of Europe, and is it different from Europe in terms of archaeological finds and the people who are, as it were, colonising it rather than just passing through?
We do have some peculiarly idiosyncratic insular traditions.
Things change.
Yes. You know, some of the types of monuments that we find in the late Neolithic, particularly, which is a period of you know, massive monument building, are unique to Britain. I mean, earlier prehistoric monuments, you know, the long barrows, the causewayed enclosures, they've got direct antecedents on the continent. You know, these are ideas that come in with the Neolithic, with pottery and domesticated animals and things like that. But we do develop peculiar traditions after that, particularly construction, as I say, of some of these huge, monstrous monuments, you know, like the massive henges, things like Silbury Hill. You know, nowhere else in Europe do they build monumental mounds on that scale, which have apparently no purpose whatsoever. So, and no, they're not prehistoric job creation schemes. There's something deeply symbolic about them, but which we can't understand. But yes, we are. I think it's wonderful that we are individual and idiosyncratic, and long may it stay that way.
Do you have a book that's on sale outside?
No.
You don't. Very good.
I don't have a book to sell.
I won't promote the book, but I'm sure people would buy it. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I speak for us all to say thank you so much indeed, Julian, for a fascinating talk. It's sort of set the imagination on fire. Your eloquence and expertise is just phenomenal. Thank you for coming this evening. A safe journey home. Would you thank our speaker again, please?